Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. A few months ago, I put up a video discussing some of my key takeaways from the book called Free Capital, which basically covers the investing journey of several financially independent investors based in the UK. My recommendation still stands that this book is definitely worth a read, and I have a link to it in the video description below. But in this video, I wanted to cover something else besides the specifics of the investors' journeys, which you should read about for yourself. There is a section here about the characteristics of what is so-called the free capitalists. Free capitalists is just a fancy term for having financial independence. So the author has gone through and taken a look at all of the shared attributes that are common among the investors profiled in this book, and they are split into three categories, which are the life choices and chances, which is basically the decisions and events that have led these investors to become financially independent and in the financial place that they are. The next is the attitudes, or sort of the habits and the characteristics of thought that these investors have. And then the actual working methods, so specific tools or methods that these investors use to remain and continue to gain financial independence. Now, of course, we don't necessarily have to follow any of these methods to achieve financial independence for ourselves, but it is, in my opinion, very helpful and interesting to think about the ways that people who have already made it to where I want to be have acted and behaved in the past. So I think it is worth a review, and let me know in the comments below if any of these characteristics really stick out to you, if there's anything missing from this list that you would include, or if there's any habits that you're trying to acquire that didn't make it into this book. With all that said, let's jump into the characteristics of the free capitalists. Oh, and one more thing that I want to point out before starting is the author is very explicit in stating that while there are a lot of commonalities between these investors, they also share a lot of differences. And that's really important to take into consideration, because none of us come from the same educational backgrounds, the same upbringings. So our circumstances may be very different, but it is interesting to see the commonalities despite the differences that have helped these investors achieve financial independence. Okay, so the first section is called Life Choices and Chances. Aside from the fact that these investors are located in the UK, a lot of them have very differing backgrounds. One of the really important commonalities that they share is having a future time perspective. This was a term that I hadn't really explored before actually reading this passage, but there's a concept in psychology called time perspective where specific humans are predisposed to thinking about the world through different time lenses. So some people are very heavily geared towards focusing on the present. They always live for the moment. Same goes for people thinking about the past. They have a tendency to dwell on the past. And of course, there are people who always are looking to the future, planning ahead, not necessarily thinking about the past, and maybe not being all that present either. For me, I don't think of investing as a get-rich-quick scheme or anything like that. And in fact, I think the long-term horizon, especially for a small retail investor like myself, is actually my biggest advantage over other hedge funds that might hopefully let me outperform in the long run. So having a future time perspective is really important because it is basically an ingrained trait that we want to save now so we can prosper in the future. Say if you have a more heavy present time perspective, you might be more encouraged to or more prone to spend right now instead of saving. And as we know, compound interest works over time. And I think future time perspective is very helpful for taking advantage of the long-term compounding effects. And I think this is one of the things where there might be some natural disposition. I don't know. I'm not a scientist, but it's something that it seems like we can train ourselves to think about different areas of our lives in different perspectives. For instance, meditation, the practice of meditation is something to bring you into the present. So there are techniques that we can use to bring ourselves into the present. I think thinking about future prosperity with investing is something that can be acquired through diligence and dedication, but it does help if that is your natural predisposition. So the next one is mostly a life choice that, yes, we all have the choice to have fewer dependents. Now, one of the things is most of these investors are young. So naturally, at a younger age, especially as time goes on, generations go on, we have fewer dependents earlier on in life. So if you are under 30 and don't have any children, I think that's a fairly normal occurrence. So for achieving financial independence, having fewer dependents is obviously a huge benefit because, well, you only have to spend on yourself. And if you don't have a dependent such as a spouse who might be relying on you for income or children to take care of, you can, especially if you're super future oriented, you can live like basically a monk and save 80% of your income and just live off of the bare minimum. Not having dependents allows you to take a few more risks in life. So say you wanted to maybe save up money after your first few years of working and quit to focus on full-time work. If you're unmarried, if you don't have children, that's a lot easier to achieve than if you actually need money to put food on the table for your survival. And this is in no way an endorsement of choosing to not have a spouse or children just to achieve financial independence earlier, but it is one option available to us. And if that floats your boat, then, go for it. The next category of life choices was pretty interesting, and the author calls it the ambivalence about careers. So most of these guys did work in jobs such as investment banking, or they were computer engineers and things of that nature. And to be honest, most of these guys didn't actually hate their jobs with an intense passion. They really were just using it as a means maybe to pay their mortgage, but there was no disgust. Here's a quote: Vince regarded his earlier career as a motor company executive as just a job, a way to apply for a mortgage. And some of these people had grown weary of the politics, but it wasn't necessarily the work that they despised. With a few exceptions, none of these guys were CEOs of companies or had huge responsibilities at companies. And many of them were actually in between jobs when they decided to focus full-time on investing. So that's some interesting food for thought. I don't know exactly what that says. Is it important that they didn't actually hate their jobs? One thing it says to me is that they were able to sort of put up with going through the motions of their careers to, save up a little bit of money. And in turn, they explored their investing careers on the side. And then eventually all of these guys were able to go full time. So the ambivalence about careers is one of the safer routes I think we can take. And it's one that I'm kind of doing right now, is working a job and trying to save as much as I can and investing the difference that I don't actually need for survival. I don't hate my job. In fact, I quite enjoy it a lot of the times. Computer programming is fun. Building stuff on the internet is fun. Investing is also fun. I don't necessarily know if this trade is going to actually make you a better investor, but it's an interesting data point. Another thing these investors have in common is that none of them were overnight successes. Now, one thing to keep in mind about a book like Free Capital is it profiles investors that have successfully survived through financial independence based on their investing careers. Now, that's a lot of survivorship bias. There are a lot of investors who probably maybe would have fit the bill for a year and, fell off and did not survive. So that's one important thing to keep in mind. But none of these guys became rich overnight. They kept at it and were persistent and eventually hit the promised land to the point where their income from their investments was able to cover their living expenses. And then they went from there. I don't know if this is exactly right, but I think Jeff Bezos famously asked Warren Buffett why nobody copied his investing style. And Buffett responded that his investing style was not a get-rich-quick scheme. So investing for the long term is just that. It's going to happen over the long term, and if you keep at it consistently, if that's through an index fund or through making individual investments, the longer time horizon is definitely going to help you there. The next one is about the health of these investors, which is kind of interesting. This is not something that might apply to the broader spectrum of folks out there, but it's ill health as a career constraint. Unfortunately, or fortunately for some of these investors profiled in the book, they really had some pretty serious health issues, some to the fact where they couldn't work a normal job because of severe pain. So that's a pretty interesting commonality for some of these investors, because this is not an endorsement for having a serious illness, but it is a very valuable insight into why investing as a hobby is so wonderful. I personally think that having better health over the long term is going to help everybody's investing career, but Needless to say, we don't need to be able to sprint 40-yard dashes at the NFL Combine or lift 500 pounds on your deadlift. Most of what investing is matters, as Monish Pabrai says, from the neck up. So as long as this is intact, you're going to have potentially a wonderful investing career. So a lot of these folks, they weren't able to work typical careers, and they found investing as a mental exercise that they were able to do more than competently. They were able to excel in it. And from that, they became financially independent. So even though they were physically not so able-bodied, their mental game and their mental capacity was enough to achieve what they wanted. It reminds me of that old story that Warren Buffett tells pretty frequently, that your body is like a car. It's like the only car you're ever going to get. And you can either tear up the interior, you can never change the oil, or you can wash the car every day, you can wax it, you can condition the leather, all those things. Are we going to let gunk pile up in our engine, or are we going to do something about it and be proactive about our health, which not only will benefit our investing career, but the prosperity of hopefully many aspects of our lives. And next we have technology as a facilitator. Now, this one may be less relevant than at the time that the investors in this book were profiled, but there was a story of one investor who would wait outside the train station every night and gather all the discarded newspapers from all the business folks that were departing for the day. That was his main source of information, was looking at discarded newspapers. Now we can go for free on any number of websites like Ticker or Morningstar or Yahoo Finance and find all of the financial data that we could ever possibly need to analyze a public company. I mean, think about how Warren Buffett went through thousands of pages of the Moody's manuals just to find stocks that were selling for less than the next year's earnings, for example. Now we have electronic screeners that could throw up that type of result instantaneously. So I think for everybody now, the question isn't whether or not we have access to all the right information, because we really do. We have all of the financial data available at our fingertips. The important part is the analysis of that information that hopefully gives us a divergent view from the crowd that will hopefully give us some insight into some type of situation that will give us an advantage. So it's not the abundance really of information, it's the perception of that information that's available. All right, moving on to the attitudes that these investors shared. The first one being that money is about freedom and not consumption. And I think this is a really important distinction. There's a huge difference between making the amount of money that you would need to go on lavish vacations every month and buy mansions all across the country versus living a relatively modest lifestyle, a lifestyle that maybe your neighbors wouldn't even know that you're financially independent. I keep going back to Warren Buffett, but he's literally the perfect example of this. The guy's been living in the same house that he's lived his first purchased home. He's been living in it in Omaha. He makes a salary of $100,000 per year through Berkshire, and his biggest luxury is, of course, his private jet. It would be very difficult to maintain financial independence if your goal is to spend as much money as you can every year. Financial independence to me is defined as when your passive investments generate enough income for you to live off of that are greater than your expenses every year. At that point, you've passed into financial independence. And there are two ways to sort of tip the scales in your favor. One important one is to increase your savings. And by virtue of that, you are decreasing your desire for consumption. I don't know if any of the investors in this book were setting out to be one of the wealthiest men on the earth. None of them had aspirations to become Warren Buffett or like Elon Musk or Bill Gates. But they have enough where they're living happy, healthy lives, doing what they love, doing exactly what they want to be doing. That's something to keep in mind. While financial independence is not an easy goal to achieve, it is more achievable if your expectations for your future self are a little more modest than, maybe some MTV Cribs star or something. Next is one that personally hits me very close to home, and that is all these investors have a low appetite for leverage. So it's pretty self-explanatory. Nobody's taking out massive credit card debt or loans to fund investments. Leverage is one of the things that scares me because if things are going well, leverage can bump up your returns pretty healthily, but at the same time, it works exactly in the opposite direction when times are tough. For me, the name of the game is to stay in the game. And with leverage, I feel that I have a lot greater chance to knock myself out of the game, even though I do have the chance to, become financially independent sooner using leverage. It's not a risk I'm willing to take. And so I really value this lesson here. The next one is enjoying the process, not the proceeds. Now, this goes a little bit back to the idea that financial freedom is not about consumption. It's about freedom of time, freedom of choice. So you can achieve financial independence in a wide array of ways. You could found a company. You could work at a high-paying salaried job for a long time, starting your own business, or you can earn it through investing. But if you aren't enjoying what you're doing every day while you're doing it, first of all, it's going to be very hard to be good at something that you don't enjoy doing. That's something that Charlie Munger says all the time. I think he said it at the most recent Berkshire Hathaway annual meeting. You probably won't succeed in something that you don't actually enjoy doing. Investing doesn't have to be your life's work, but it should be something that you enjoy. If you're doing it just for the money, again, that probably is going to go back to the idea that you may not succeed because your motivations are sort of based on the wrong foundation. I think it's important, whatever we're doing, to want to tap dance to work. Ideally, we don't call our work actual work because it's so fun to do what we do. And in the case of investing, being able to continuously read about a wide variety of topics, figure out business models, read history, all of this is applicable to our investing journey, and it's just a hell of a time. And the last one under the attitude section is not team players. So we could call this the lone wolves section. And Monish Pabrai has talked about this, that and up until very recently, he was a one-man shop. Besides administrative assistants, he was the only analyst looking at investments for Pabrai funds. Investments is not a team sport. And Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, especially in their early careers, they ran their funds solo by themselves. And that doesn't mean that you don't talk to other investors, but it does mean that independence of thought and ideas need to come from your own brain. Conviction needs to come from yourself. And while they might not all generate all of their investment ideas originally, of course, nobody does that. The conviction in the idea must come from the self. I'll read this final quote that is mentioned from Warren Buffett about Walter Schloss. I don't seem to have very much influence on Walter. That's one of his strengths. Nobody seems to have much influence on him. Okay, onto the working methods that are shared with these investors. The first one is that these investors are foxes, not hedgehogs. Now, this comes from an old Greek poet who is known as saying, the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. This is one of the things that Charlie Munger advocates above all else, and he's most famous for his lattice work of mental models, particularly in the areas of psychology, combining psychology and physics, the other sciences, and business and economics. Most importantly, foxes are agile of thought, and they don't need to be stuck to any one single approach for investing to make it work. Whereas hedgehogs may come at it from a very narrow point of view, even if the subject matter is large. Some hedgehog categories might be macroeconomics, whereas foxes come at things, as I would say, from the bottom up, combining a bunch of different ideas to come to a solution that is hopefully going to turn out to be a good investment. For instance, some of these people have made wealth through both day trading and long-term investments, whereas if we look at some hedge funds, they're stuck to a single thing. They have to be, long only in, say, Japanese mid-cap equities or something. So the foxes have a lot more of an opportunity to learn more about the world, which in turn should hopefully help them turn over more rocks through investment. The next trait is applying sophistication in different dimensions. Now, this one's not that straightforward, but basically all of the investors in this book have different strengths. Some of them had great academic careers with wonderful credentials. Some of them talk to management, and some of them are really outgoing. And some of these guys, all they do is read annual reports or stare at the candlesticks on the moving day trading charts. But whatever they do, they apply their strength in that way. So if you think that you have an edge looking at an investment through the lens of human psychology, then do that. That's one important way to differentiate yourself. So just because an investor has a PhD from some elite institution doesn't mean that he's going to be a better investor than somebody who came from a relatively modest academic background. They have different strengths, and they leverage those strengths to help them make better investments. Next, this is one of my favorites, is most of these investors ran concentrated portfolios. I think this is really important, especially for trying to achieve financial independence earlier than many people. This one's pretty self-explanatory, and I've gone through it at length in another video over here, which talks more about my philosophy about concentrated investing. This is a trait that's shared with most of the successful investors that I can think of: Warren Buffett, Charlie Munger, Joel Greenblatt. In their early days, they all had highly concentrated portfolios with high conviction ideas. Another method that's very beneficial for the small retail investor is looking at only smaller companies as well. So of course, that's not to say that we exclude anything that's in the S&P 500 and only look at microcaps. But one of the traits that all of these investors share is that many of them made a lot of money in lesser known companies. First of all, smaller companies are generally less well researched because most of the bigger hedge funds really can't move the needle if they invest in a smaller company. They could, buy 10% of a $100 million market cap company. And if the fund is managing $5 billion, that's pretty much nothing, even if the company quadruples in size. And there are small company specific traits. Maybe the management is more open to talking to individual investors. You can actually own a larger share of a smaller company. That's where the inefficiencies in the market are. So of course, it's natural that a lot of these folks would invest in companies like that. So concentrated portfolios with smaller companies seems like a pretty good way to go based on the investors' experiences in this book. The next one is not taking advice, which kind of goes back to the investment team of one idea, where there's a huge element of self-reliance for these guys, especially intellectually. They do look at ideas produced by others, but again, being told that something is a good investment isn't typically how they go about investing in a company or gaining conviction. It's the same thing with shameless cloning. Shameless cloning doesn't mean blindly following. It means using other ideas and then building conviction for yourself in order to decide whether or not that investment's right for you. The next one is bulletin boards. This is a concrete idea. I'm sure many of us use this idea, and I would call YouTube investing videos sort of this bulletin board aspect, but many of these folks in here are active participants or were active participants in some investment boards. We have investment boards that throw up a ton of ideas like Value Investors Club or Sum Zero or things of that nature. We have Twitter, which is a huge source of information. There's investor letters that we can read that are very generous with their ideas. This is the enablement that technology has given us. We have so much information, and it's great. And again, you don't have to post on bulletin boards or anything like that, but being an active participant, posting investment ideas is a good way to get critiques and feedback on your investment ideas, where you might have holes in your logic, things of that nature. So if you're up to exposing your ideas, that could be a good way to go. And last but not least is that investing is a craft, not a science. Basically, there's no one formula for investment success. And I think at the end of the day, that's one of the main takeaways from Free Capitalist. So I started the video off talking about how many of these investors have a lot of differences. And that's differences in methods too. Now, all of these traits that we've talked about are pretty high level. The author specifically states that none of these investors are using modern portfolio theory or anything like that to determine the best portfolio construction or the best investments to make. Investing is a practical science, if you will. It's an art. You can describe trends and all sorts of things beautifully in words, but in the heat of the moment, investing is a living, breathing thing, and that's what your portfolio is. The world changes. We have mental models in our heads, and sometimes they match up perfectly, and those aid us in making better investment decisions. And sometimes those mental models that we have need to change based on changes in the world. There's no prescription for this thing. Investing is growing. As investors, we're only going to be as good as we are willing to continue to grow and learn and change the way that we think about the world when necessary. The biggest mistake we can make is to stay stagnant in the same place. Investing is an opportunistic business. It's a living, breathing business. There's no textbook or theory that's going to ever tell you the appropriate position to take. That's for us to decide on the fly with dedicated study and continuous learning. That was a bit of a longer video, but I hope you enjoyed this discussion of my takeaways from Free Capital about the shared characteristics of all of these financially independent investors. If you enjoyed this video, you may enjoy this video over here that the YouTube algorithm has picked out for you. If you like this video, please like the video and subscribe for more. Thank you so much for watching this all the way to the end. I really appreciate your time, and I will see you in the next video.